And then there were three Ivy League institutions that remain test optional. That is the topic of today's video. My name is Craig Meister. I'm a college admissions coach. You can learn more about me and how you can work with me one-on-one throughout the entire college admissions process on my website, which is collegemeister.com. If you're interested, by the way, in learning about whether you or your student is on track for selective college admission, you should go to my new online assessment, which is free of charge and only takes 3 minutes to complete. It's areyouontracktogetin.com. That's areyouontracktogetin.com. I'll also link to both of those websites right below this video. Cornell University has announced that it is going to be test required again during the 2025-2026 admission cycle, which means that first year students starting in August/September of 2026, the college graduating class of 2030 at Cornell they'll all need to take the SAT or ACT in order to be considered for admission. This is a huge turnaround because Cornell wasn't just a school that went test optional during the early days of the pandemic in 2020. It was a school that some of its constituent schools went test blind or test free. Let me read to you the release by Cornell University, because this is all very interesting. The timing is fascinating because we're in April 2024, and in recent weeks, four Ivy League schools beyond Cornell have announced that they are going back to test required for the 2024-25 admission cycle for those first-year students entering in fall 2025. But now we get Cornell announcing that they're going test required again during the 2025-2026 admission cycle. Fascinating, because this is going to really confuse a lot of individuals who can't keep these things straight. I mean, I obviously live and breathe this. This is my career. This is my job. I know what I'm talking about. I've been doing this for 18 years. But kids who just are sort of passing notes to each other in class or whatever they're doing on Snapchat or whatever they're doing it on, this is getting a little complicated. All these announcements about different years yet. And Cornell, again, was a school that was already sort of complicated because it was test optional in some ways. It was test blind in other ways. But now, again, like I said, for the next year, it will remain this sort of hybrid of test optional and test blind/test free. But for the 2025-2026 cycle, it's going to be test required again. That means the majority of Ivy League schools, 5, are test required again. That means, like I said, 3 remain as test optional for now. God knows what will happen next. But here we go. Here is the release from the Cornell Chronicle. Cornell will reinstitute standardized testing requirements for the students seeking undergraduate admission for fall 2026 enrollment based on evidence from a multi-year study conducted by the university's task force on standardized testing in admissions. Cornell will remain test optional for students applying in the upcoming admission cycle. So even though they say there's data supporting why they're doing it, they're in no rush to start implementing, what they think is a data-based solution. So again, I shouldn't be talking as an aside. Let me just read the release. Cornell will remain test optional for the students applying for the upcoming admission cycle for the enrollment in fall 2025. Although, and this is important, these applicants, meaning those applying in fall 2024 for fall 2025, those applicants are encouraged to submit SAT and or ACT scores to the Cornell colleges and schools that are currently test optional. This is key because not all of Cornell's schools are test optional as of today. There are some that are test free. To provide students with time to prepare and take standardized tests, Cornell, they're a good citizen. That's what it is. Cornell is doing this because even though it's very confusing, because a lot of their peer institutions are saying for fall 2024, you got to start applying, entering fall 2025. But for the fall 2024 admission cycle, you got to start taking these tests. Cornell is a good guy. They're a good guy over at Cornell. And they're giving you plenty of time if you are in the high school graduating class of 2026 they're giving, and younger, you have now plenty of time to get your ducks in a row. Start working with an expensive test prep tutor. Start buying the test prep books or the online things from Khan Academy or wherever. Do whatever you need to do. Or is that free? Khan Academy may be free. I don't want to speak against Khan Academy. Whatever it may be. I'm not against paid test prep. Whatever you got to do, if you take it seriously, prep. They're warning you to provide, quote, I shouldn't speak out of turn. I keep doing that. Quote, to provide students with time to prepare and take standardized tests, Cornell will remain test optional for those applying to enroll for fall 2025 to the College of Arts and Sciences, Cornell Engineering, the College of Human Ecology, the Cornell Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy, and the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. However, while submission of SAT and/or ACT scores is optional, it is recommended for students applying to enroll in fall 2025, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business will remain score-free. Test blind. Those are Craig's words, test blind. Effective for those applying to enroll for fall 2026 or beyond, applicants to all 8 Cornell undergraduate colleges and schools will be required to submit standardized test scores in 2020, partly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I got to sort of see their release at the time because I don't recall them saying it was just partly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but maybe they did. I mean, most schools said it was all because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but most schools just wanted more applicants and wanted to keep up with the Joneses and had other sort of social, political reasons for doing it. But in fall of 2020, partly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, test scores became optional at 5 of Cornell's undergraduate colleges and schools. Again, Arts and Sciences, Cornell Engineering, Human Ecology, and the Brooks School and the ILR School, and were not considered by 3 others: Cornell CALS, AAP, and SC Johnson College. That's a business school. Analyzing admissions since 2020, the task force found that when reviewed in context with other application materials such as GPA, academic rigor, extracurricular engagement, essay and letters of recommendations, and test scores help create a more complete picture. No, you know what, Sherlock. Test scores help to create a more complete picture of an individual applicant. You needed a task force to tell you that? They're geniuses over at Cornell. Wow. Those standardized test scores are imperfect measures of a student's aptitude and potential. If you can't stand me narrating this, by the way, there's a link to this whole release below this video. But I'm going to keep going. Those standardized test scores are imperfect measures of a student's aptitude and potential. The data suggests that when taken in context, these scores provide valuable insights into a student's potential for academic success while at Cornell, and thereby help to ensure that admitted students are likely to thrive academically. After accounting for other predictors, including high school GPA, student demographics, and high school characteristics, those who were admitted with test scores tended to have somewhat stronger GPAs and were more likely to remain in academic good standing. I read that backwards, good academic standing. The data also showed that test optional policies may have inadvertent consequences. Cornell's fall 2022 new student survey showed that 91% of matriculating first-year students took the SAT and/or ACT at least once. 70% did it multiple times, but only 28% of applicants opted to provide test scores, even though doing so could have advantaged them. Quote, while it may seem counterintuitive, considering these test scores actually promotes access to students from a wider range of backgrounds and circumstances, end quote, said Provost Michael Kotlikoff. Quote, our analysis indicates that instituting the testing requirement likely enhances rather than diminishes our ability to identify and admit qualified students. Students' decisions to share test scores are shaped by social background factors such as the type of high school they attended, their family income, and their access to and use of college counseling. Students from different kinds of backgrounds may decide to withhold scores that are strong enough to help them get in or gain access to Cornell, which means that test optional policies may undermine equity. So what you need to understand, Look how they're framing this. We're going back to test required to promote equity. A few years ago, we actually got rid of testing to promote equity. Now we are going back to testing to promote equity. This makes sense, right? For example, an applicant might choose not to submit a score that is at or slightly below Cornell's median score, even though a reviewer would note favorably that the score is in the top tier for that student's high school. Such an application would be stronger with the score included. Now that is key. That is a key sentence because that's how they're going to do it. That's how, and I've said it in previous videos, that's the way they're trying to frame it. It's not going to be based on your individual demographics when you can get into Cornell with a 1350. It's going to be based off of your high school's demographics. And I'm not talking about race even. I'm talking about the average SAT and ACT scores reported on your high school profile. If you're scoring above that, especially if you're in the top 25th percentile, if your score reports in percentiles, sort of like in the middle 50%, that's going to be considered by some reviewers at Cornell to be a positive thing, depending on what else they learn about you elsewhere, of course. Now, that's where we're in real gray territory and real lawsuit territory, because it's very important that standards are applied consistently for there not to be a lawsuit. But we know that in the world of college admissions, they don't like paper trails. So this is fascinating. There will be kids in the new regime at Cornell in the class of 2020-30 at Cornell who got in with a 1350 because at their high school, most kids are scoring in the 1100s or lower on the SAT. But then there will be other kids who do not make the Cornell class of 2030 who got a 1590 on their SAT, who go to a high school where most kids are scoring, let's say, in the 1300s or 1400s, and Cornell's going to get away with doing this. In some cases. What cases? Again, I have my thoughts as to when they do this more versus other times, but I see a very small sliver of the students getting in or rejected from Cornell, so I don't have enough data to publish a study. But what I would say is what I've been saying all along, which is the test optional movement has helped individuals of three demographics: legacy students, athletes, and individuals who the college in question consider underrepresented minorities. The willingness to consider accepting a student to Cornell under the new regime will benefit those same people very well. Legacies, athletes, and what the college wants more of, what they deem to be underrepresented. How they're underrepresented now, of course, in a post-affirmative action world is not necessarily based off of race. It's going to be based off of, we don't have enough people who are strong performers at low-performing high schools. That is sort of the honeypot. That is sort of the thing that they're going to point to. I could do a whole nother, and I will. Remind me to do this if I don't do this, but I'm going to do a whole nother video on how the UC system, which I rarely talk about, by the way, in my videos, the UC system. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but I could do a whole video on the way the UC system has gotten around affirmative action based on high school, based on where you go to high school. But this is the same thing. And all the Ivies that have announced recently have said basically the same thing in maybe different words, which is we are not going to have consistent standards for what scores you need to earn on the SAT or ACT. We're having no standards for that. We just want to see the scores so that we can pick and choose the students we want to pick anyway. And we could be picking some kids in the 1200s. We could be picking some kids in 1600 on the SAT or the equivalent on the ACT 36. But it's all for your own good, darn it. it all depends on how, the community you came from and the opportunities you had. And for some kids, getting a 1280 on the SAT is an amazing accomplishment, is what Cornell is arguing here. Now, should that kid be in a classroom with a kid who got a 5090 on the SAT in the same major? Well, that's a judgment call for all of us to make. I'd make the argument that it doesn't do anyone any favors to put those two individuals together because they're quite disparate in terms of outputs. But Cornell will have a range of students that they're always willing to accept. And of course, depending on how wealthy one is or who makes a call for who, all of these colleges have always made some exceptions for people who are not qualified to be at a school based off of academic merit. But Ivies were known for most of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2010s for being relatively consistent with their review of test scores as a standard. These tests used to be called standardized tests. The standardized aptitude test. That was the old name of the SAT before it just became SAT. So this is fascinating. The majority of Ivy League schools are now going to be test required again. Let me read the last paragraph. I went off on a huge tangent. Quote, while important, standardized test scores represent only one of many factors we consider in the admissions process, end quote, said Lisa Nishi, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Interim Vice Provost for Enrollment. Quote, in addition to test scores, Cornell will consider both the context provided by the rest of the student's application materials and the context of where they are applying from, their high school, their personal circumstances, and background. We are committed to evaluating an applicant's academic preparedness as well as how their unique interests, lived experiences, and strengths will contribute to Cornell's vision of, quote, any person, any study, end quote, end quote. By the way, Cornell does not like using the Oxford comma in their releases because I'm a huge fan of it, but they did not use that at least twice in that release. So again, that's exactly what I just said. Basically, colleges are now going back to test required because they think they can pick and choose people legally. They found a way to pick and choose who they want to accept anyway and are not going to have consistent standards. If they had to have consistent standards, they would not be going back to test required. But they don't have to have consistent standards because they feel like they have found a way through sort of high school profiles and through the context of lived experiences. That's a key word, lived experiences. It used to be to say, through one's life, but it's key that they're saying lived experiences because that uses the word experience. And as I've stated previously, and I'm going to do a whole nother video on shortly, one's experiences can include one's racial experiences. According to the powers that be in higher education, particularly in the Ivy Tower schools like the Ivies, lived experiences and racial experiences have nothing to do with one's racial status. And so again, I will be doing another video on that later this week. So stay tuned for that. But long story short, Penn, Princeton, and Columbia are the final three little Indians. I said it. There used to be a thing like 5 little, 3 little, 4 little Indians, 6 little, 7 little, 8 little Indians. That song. That's a song. It was a movie too, I think. It was a book. So I'm just referring to Indians in that context. I'm not in any way saying anything pro or con about Indians. What I'm simply saying is the last 3 little Indians standing are Penn, Princeton, and Columbia as test optional institutions in the Ivy League. This is fascinating. The Ivy League is majority test required again. And it's fascinating, again, the last 3, Penn, Princeton, and Columbia. Columbia has stated, though, again, we can't take any institution at its word for long because a few weeks ago, Harvard had stated that they were going to be test optional for 2 more years, and then they rescinded that they rescinded it. So Columbia could do the same thing, but Columbia has stated in the last year that they will remain test optional to perpetuity. Penn and Princeton are fascinating because One has had some leadership change over in recent months, and there's a lot of other sort of tumult on that campus. And Princeton is, in the suburb in New Jersey that's sort of, like hanging out there in New Jersey between Philly and New York, just sort of hiding from the limelight right now. They're Harvard, Yale, all these other schools, Columbia, they're all getting massive press for other reasons. So Princeton is just keeping its head down. So it's interesting. It will be interesting to see if these three, continue to be test optional. I mean, assuming you would think that now with all the data and the studies and the committees at these prestigious, eminent Ivy League schools saying that basically test optional goes against all of our goals. I don't know how Penn, Princeton, and Columbia will stay in their current stance forever, but they could. Anything's possible. Anything is possible. I mean, there are other admission standards that are different between different Ivy League schools. I mean, for many years, certain Ivy League schools have never interviewed, and others have interviewed. And some have optional interviews, some required the interview for many years, or at least really encouraged it. So it's not unprecedented for Ivy League schools to have different admission standards. Of course, they can have very drastically different sort of approaches to admissions. But this is probably the biggest. I mean, standardized tests are a huge part of the process for going through the undergraduate admissions process for a first-year applicant. It's a huge component of it. If you can avoid it, that's a hugely different process. So the Ivy League is very different these days in terms of where you're going. I mean, basically, everyone applying to Princeton, Penn, and Columbia is taking these tests. Almost everyone, because they're all wanting to get into Cornell, Harvard, Yale, Brown, and Dartmouth too, or schools like that, like Caltech or MIT. So, or Georgia Tech, or even Purdue, these are schools that are all back to test required. Some never left. Schools like UF and Florida State, obviously, those aren't always on the same lists with Harvard and Yale, but sometimes they are. But the point being, this can't stand long. I can't imagine. I mean, it could obviously, but it's an interesting branch on which to be sitting out on that branch. Columbia is very much out on the branch, but Penn and Princeton are on there too. They'll maybe announce soon too that in 2026 or whatever, like Cornell, they're going to go back, but maybe they won't. We'll see what happens. In the interim, if you are a high school student or a parent of one, it's most likely that you want to do your best or have your student do his or her best on the SAT or ACT. So that is, we've turned the corner here. We have the majority of Ivy League schools are test required. The reason this matters is not just because it's the Ivy League and it's the Ivy League. It's because most other higher education institutions and the people who populate them today are so enamored with the prestige and the status that is the Ivies. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not saying they should be, but it's true that this is going to put a lot of mental pressure on individuals in ways you may not even realize, whether it be at USC or at Rice or it's just other schools. And so it will be interesting, how this plays out over the coming days, weeks, and months. But basically, we're returning to a regime that is some thought we would never return to. There were people who thought they had put the final nail in the coffin of the SAT and ACT. I mean, ACT has recently reverted to, basically been bought out for a for-profit company. That's how much money they've been losing in this test optional environment because no one's sending scores anymore. Also, even if they send the scores, they're self-reporting as opposed to sending the official scores. So they are just, deep trouble financially. So they are reinventing themselves. SAT, of course, has recently turned into a digital test all around the world. So these testing companies sort of have gone through a major redesign in the back end themselves to survive. And survive they have. Because now that the Ivies are majority test required again, the tide has turned. The tide has turned, and this will filter down. It's not going to go everywhere, of course, because many colleges have loved being test optional and will remain test optional. It's really helped their bottom lines. It's really helped diversify the college campus and the way the college wants to be diversified. There's a lot of upshots to it just in terms of street cred and cocktail parties and stuff. So there's reasons why the people in charge are doing this, and a lot of them will remain this. But the fact that these Ivies are couching their decision all in the terms of equity is going to also make it harder to withstand test optional, because certain colleges that are lower ranked are going to be sort of appear to be on the wrong side of the equity debate, which is fascinating, because the whole reason they went test optional was because they wanted to be on the right side of the equity debate or discussion. And they wanted to be the most pro-equity, these test optional schools. And now the equity train has left the station, and it's with the test required schools, according to the test required schools, who are saying that they're going back to being test required because they douse themselves in equity. They believe in it so much they have to do it. So this is going to be a very hard sort of bridge to this is very hard for these institutions of not just Ivies, but all institutions are going to increasingly be real out on a limb if they remain test optional, because other very well-known names in this world are saying that test optional is actually discriminatory or could be hurting the people we want to hurt the least. So this will be interesting to continue to watch. My name again is Craig Meister. I hope this has been edifying. Again, if you are interested in working with me one-on-one throughout the college admissions process, go to my website, collegemeister.com. If you're interested in learning if you or your student are on track or is on track for selective college admission, please go to areyouontracktogetin.com. It's a 3-minute assessment. It's free. You will be emailed your results promptly. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up or consider subscribing to my channel. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and most importantly, stay stress-free throughout the entire college admissions process.